In the spring of 1846, a little girl named Patty Reed packed a tiny wooden doll into her dress and set off with her family to walk to the other side of the world. She was 8 years old. She did not know that the journey ahead would take her family through deserts and over mountains. She did not know that she would watch grown men weep and strong oxen die, and that she would come closer to death than any child should ever come. She did not know that of the 87 people who set out with her that spring, nearly half would never arrive. She only knew that they were going to California, to a place, they said, where the land was free and the sun was warm and a family could build a better life. That was the dream. That was what pulled them west, away from everything they had ever known, into a wilderness that would test them beyond anything they could have imagined. This is the story of those 87 people, the families who loaded their whole lives into wooden wagons and set out, full of hope, toward a promised land. It is the story of the choices they made, some wise, some catastrophic, and of the terrible winter that trapped them high in the mountains, with the snow rising around them and the food running out. It is a story that has become legend. You may even think you know how it ends. But behind the legend are real people. Real mothers who held their starving children through the freezing nights. Real fathers who walked into the white wilderness looking for help and were never seen again. Real children, like little Patty Reed, who somehow lived through a nightmare that killed the adults all around them. And it is a story not only of horror, but of love. Of a mother who gave up her own life so her children might live. Of a stranger who walked back into the frozen mountains, again and again, carrying children out on his own back. Of ordinary people who, faced with the absolute end of everything, discovered what they were truly made of. Stay with me, because the story of the Donner Party is not really a story about death in the mountains. It is a story about how far human beings will go for the people they love. And by the end, you will understand why, more than 170 years later, we still remember the names of those who walked into the snow. It began, as so many American stories of that time began, with a dream of the West. In the 1840s, a kind of fever swept across the United States. They called it the Pull of the West. Beyond the settled towns of the East, beyond the wide Mississippi, lay a vast and largely unknown continent. And at the far edge of it, more than 2,000 miles away, lay California, a land that existed in the minds of ordinary Americans as something close to paradise. The soil was rich, the weather was gentle, land was cheap or even free for those willing to make the journey and claim it. For families struggling to make a living in the crowded East, it was an irresistible vision, a chance to start over, a chance to give their children something better. All they had to do was get there. And getting there meant a journey of unimaginable scale. 2,000 miles on foot and by wagon across plains and deserts and mountains through lands where there were no roads, no towns, no help if anything went wrong. It would take 4 to 6 months of hard, relentless travel. And it had to be timed perfectly. Leave too early in the spring and the trails would be thick with mud. Leave too late or move too slowly, and you risked being caught by the snows of the western mountains before you could cross them. Thousands of families made that gamble in those years. Most of them made it through. They are not the ones we remember. We remember the ones who did not. The families at the heart of our story came from Springfield, Illinois. They were not poor. They were not desperate. That is one of the things that makes their fate so haunting. They were prosperous, respectable people who had everything to live for and who chose to risk it all for the promise of something even better. There was George Donner, a successful farmer in his 60s, well-liked and well-off, who would be chosen as the captain of the group and give it his name. There was his brother Jacob. And there was James Reed, a businessman and furniture maker, ambitious and proud, traveling with his wife Margaret and their children. Among those children was Patty, 8 years old, and her little brothers and sister. Margaret's elderly mother came too, though she was already frail. When they set out in April of 1846, they did so in style. The Reed family's wagon was famous among the travelers. It was enormous, 2 stories tall, with built-in beds and a stove and cushioned seats, a kind of palace on wheels. They brought fine food and books and even hired servants to help with the journey. They were not running from anything. They were riding toward a dream, and they meant to do it comfortably. The first part of the journey went well. They traveled from Springfield to Independence, Missouri, where the Great Trail West began, and there they joined a much larger wagon train, a long column of canvas-topped wagons rolling out onto the open plains. For weeks, they made good progress. The weather was kind. The plains were green and endless. Buffalo grazed in the distance. In the evenings, the families gathered around their fires, and the children played, and there was music and laughter under the wide western sky. Margaret Reed's mother died early in the journey of an illness she had carried from home and was buried gently beneath a tree on the prairie. But otherwise, those early weeks were good, hopeful. Everything they had dreamed of seemed to be coming true. Then, at a place called Fort Bridger, in what is now Wyoming, they made the decision that would destroy them. For weeks, word had been spreading among the travelers about a new route, a shortcut. A man named Lansford Hastings had been promoting it heavily, a path that, he claimed, would cut hundreds of miles off the journey to California. Instead of following the established trail, which looped north and was known to be safe, travelers could take Hastings's new cutoff, which ran south of the Great Salt Lake, straight through the wilderness. Hastings promised it would save them weeks of travel. He had even written a guidebook praising it. What he had not done, what almost no one realized, was actually test the route properly with wagons. At Fort Bridger, the travelers had a choice to make: the safe, known trail, or the tempting shortcut. Most of the wagon train chose caution and took the established route. They would arrive in California safely, but a smaller group, including the Donners and the Reeds, decided to gamble on the shortcut. They were already a little behind schedule. The promise of saving weeks was too good to resist. They chose George Donner as their captain, said goodbye to the main group, and turned their wagons toward the Hastings cutoff. It is one of the most fateful wrong turns in American history. Almost everything that went wrong afterward flowed from that single decision, made in good faith by reasonable people trying to do the right thing for their families. They could not have known. But the shortcut would cost them not weeks, but everything. The Hastings cutoff was a disaster almost from the beginning. The first sign of trouble came in the Wasatch Mountains. Hastings had promised an easy passage, but the route led the wagons into rugged, broken country choked with thick forest and steep ravines. There was no clear trail. The men had to go ahead on foot, hacking a path through the wilderness, clearing trees and rolling boulders aside so the wagons could pass. What should have taken days took weeks. The travelers grew exhausted. Their animals grew weak. And every single day they lost was a day closer to winter. By the time they struggled out of the mountains, they were already far behind schedule and worn down. But the worst was still ahead, because now they faced the desert. Hastings had assured them that the crossing of the Great Salt Lake Desert would take a single day and night. A dry stretch, yes, but a short one. In reality, it was a brutal, blistering wasteland that took them 5 days and 5 nights to cross. 5 days under a punishing sun, with no water, no shade, and no end in sight. The oxen, already weakened, began to fail. Maddened by thirst, some of them broke free and ran off into the desert, never to be found. Wagons had to be abandoned where they stood, the family's possessions left behind in the sand. The Reeds, who had begun the journey in their magnificent 2-story wagon, lost most of their oxen here, and with them, much of what they owned. When they finally staggered out of the desert, the damage was done. They had lost precious time. They had lost animals they could not replace. They had lost wagons and supplies. And they had lost something harder to measure but just as important. They had lost their unity and their hope. Tempers frayed. People began to blame one another. The group that had set out so confidently from Fort Bridger was now a tired, frightened, quarreling band strung out across the wilderness and dangerously low on food. They took stock of their supplies and realized a terrible truth. They did not have enough food to reach California. 2 of the strongest young men were sent ahead, riding hard for Sutter's Fort, the nearest settlement in California, to beg for supplies and bring them back. The rest pushed on as fast as their failing animals would allow, racing against a calendar that was turning inexorably toward winter. It was during this desperate stretch that tragedy struck the group from within. Tensions had been rising for weeks, and one day they boiled over. During an argument on the trail, James Reed, the proud businessman, became involved in a violent confrontation with another man, a young teamster. In the struggle, Reed stabbed the man and killed him. The group was thrown into turmoil. Some wanted to hang Reed on the spot. In the end, a compromise was reached, but a harsh one. Reed was banished from the wagon train. He was forced to ride ahead, alone, into the wilderness, leaving his wife Margaret and his children, including little Patty, behind with the others. It must have been an agonizing parting. Reed rode west, not knowing if he would ever see his family again. But in one of the strange ironies of this story, his banishment may have saved them all. For Reed would reach California, and from there, he would move heaven and earth to come back for the people he loved. Behind him, the rest of the party pressed on toward the mountains. It was now October, and ahead of them, rising vast and white against the sky, were the peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the last barrier between them and California. They were so close now, just one more mountain range to cross. They did not know that the snows were coming early that year. They did not know that they were already too late. They reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada at the very end of October. One more push, up and over the high mountain pass, and they would be safe. On the other side lay the gentle valleys of California and the end of their long ordeal. But the mountains had other plans. As they began to climb toward the pass, the snow began to fall. Not the gentle snow of an early winter, but a heavy, relentless storm, the first of the worst winter that region would see in living memory. The snow came down faster than they could climb. It piled up on the trail, deeper and deeper, until the wagons could go no further, until even the animals floundered helplessly in the drifts. Again and again, the desperate travelers tried to force their way up to the pass. Again and again, the snow drove them back. And then, finally, the way was simply closed. The pass was buried under snow too deep to cross. The mountains had sealed themselves shut. The Donner Party was trapped. They could not go forward. They could not go back. They were caught on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada, in the high country, as winter closed its fist around them. And so, with no other choice, they stopped beside a frozen lake and prepared to wait out the winter and pray for the snows to ease. Most of the families gathered near the lake, which today bears the name Donner Lake. There they built rough shelters, crude cabins of logs and hides, and one group took over an old cabin that had been left there years before. A few miles back, the Donner families themselves, including the Captain George Donner and his wife Tamsin, had been unable to keep up and made their camp separately at a place called Alder Creek, in tents and brush shelters thrown together against the cold. They were now divided, scattered in small, desperate groups across the frozen wilderness, each one fighting its own battle to survive. At first, they had their oxen. The animals were killed, and their meat was a grim insurance against starvation. But the snow kept falling. It fell until it was taller than a man, taller than the cabins themselves, until the families had to dig tunnels through it just to move between their shelters. It buried the bodies of the dead animals so deep they could not always be found again. The cold was merciless. The shelters were crude and leaked and offered little protection. And slowly, as the weeks passed and the snow did not stop, the food began to run out. They ate the oxen, down to the last scraps. Then they boiled the hides, the tough leather, into a foul, glue-like paste, and ate that. They ate the family dogs. They ate bones, boiled again and again until they crumbled. They ate mice and bark and twigs. Anything. Everything. The children cried with hunger that never stopped. The adults gave what little they had to the young ones and grew weaker themselves. And one by one, in the cold and the dark and the endless white silence, people began to die. The first to go were often the strong young men. Surprisingly, their larger bodies burning through their reserves faster than the women and children. They died in their sleep, or simply faded away, too weak at last to wake. Each death was a fresh horror for those who remained, and a grim question that no one yet dared to speak aloud. The dead could not be buried. The ground was frozen, iron-hard, and buried under yards of snow, so the bodies were laid outside in the snow where the cold preserved them. And in those silent forms lay the terrible choice that the living would soon be forced to face. By the middle of December, it was clear that if someone did not go for help, everyone would die. And so a group of the strongest remaining travelers made a desperate decision. They would try to walk out. They would cross the mountains on foot through the deep snow and reach California and bring back help for those left behind. There were 15 of them. They fashioned crude snowshoes from oxbows and hide, and they took with them only a few scraps of food, perhaps enough for 6 days. They were mostly young men, but there were women among them too, mothers who left their children behind in the camps in the desperate hope of saving them. They set out into the white wilderness, climbing toward the pass that had defeated them all, and this small, doomed band would later be given a name that captured everything about their journey. They were called the Forlorn Hope. What happened to the Forlorn Hope is almost beyond belief. They climbed up over the pass and down into a frozen world of endless ridges and valleys with no trail to follow and no idea how far they had to go. 6 days of food stretched into weeks of starvation. Storms battered them. They became lost. Their feet froze. They went snowblind. One by one, they began to die in the snow, the strongest of the whole party, falling in the wilderness with no one to bury them. And it was here, among the Forlorn Hope, that the survivors first faced the unspeakable choice. Starving, freezing, watching their companions die around them, with no other food of any kind, the living kept themselves alive on the bodies of the dead. It is the detail that has made this story infamous, the thing that everyone remembers. But it is worth pausing to understand what it truly was. It was not madness or savagery. It was a group of ordinary, decent people, pushed to the very edge of human endurance, doing the only thing that might allow some of them to live and to reach help for the others. They did it in grief and horror, with prayers and tears. And they did it so that others might be saved. Of the 15 who set out with the Forlorn Hope, only 7 survived. It took them more than a month. 33 days in the frozen wilderness, a journey that should have taken a week. When the last of them finally stumbled down out of the mountains, skeletal, frostbitten, half dead, they fell into the hands of a group of Native Americans who were so shocked by their condition that they wept and gave them what little food they had, acorns and grass and pine nuts, and helped them on toward the nearest ranch. The survivors of the Forlorn Hope had done the impossible. They had crossed the mountains in the dead of winter. And now, at last, word of the trapped families began to spread. Out in California, the alarm was raised. There were people still alive up there in the high mountains, buried in the snow. Women and children, starving, freezing, dying. And among those who heard the news was a man who had been waiting, in agony, for any word at all. A man who had been banished into the wilderness months before and who had never stopped trying to find a way back to his family. James Reed, Patty's father. He was alive. He had reached California. And now he knew that his wife and children were trapped in the mountains behind him, and that if someone did not reach them soon, they would die. He began, at once, to put together a rescue. The first rescue party set out at the end of January, climbing back up into the mountains that had swallowed the Donner Party months before. It was a brutal journey, even for strong, well-fed men. The snow was still impossibly deep. The cold was still deadly. But they pushed on, carrying what food they could, driven by the knowledge that every hour might mean another life lost. When they finally reached the lake camp in the 3rd week of February, what they found barely resembled the living. The cabins were buried so deep in snow that the rescuers had to call out to find them, and the survivors who emerged were like ghosts. Skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand. Many of the children were so weak they could no longer walk. Some of the people, delirious with starvation, wept with relief. Others simply stared, unable to believe that help had truly come. There was not nearly enough food and not nearly enough rescuers to save everyone at once. So the first relief party gathered up those who were strong enough to walk, mostly children and a few adults, and began the agonizing journey back down the mountain. Some of the children had to be carried, some could manage only a few steps at a time. The weakest were left behind in the camps with promises that more help was coming, a heartbreaking necessity, choosing who would have the best chance and leaving the rest to wait and pray. More rescue parties followed, struggling up into the mountains one after another through the worst of the winter weather. And with the second of them came James Reed. Imagine that moment. Reed, who had been banished months before, who had ridden away alone, not knowing if he would ever see his family again, now climbing back up into the frozen mountains, searching the buried camps for his wife and his children. And imagine the moment he found them. Patty and her little brother, still alive. The story is told that when Reed reached the camp, his children ran to him through the snow, and he fell to his knees and held them. This man who had crossed deserts and mountains and been driven out into the wilderness, weeping in the snow with his children in his arms. Not all of his family could travel yet, but they were alive. He had come back, and they were alive. The rescues went on through February and into March, party after party, each one carrying out a few more survivors, each journey a brutal ordeal of its own. One of the most terrible moments came when a group of refugees, caught in a fresh storm high on the mountain, became trapped at a place that would come to be called Starved Camp, huddled around a fire that melted down into a deep pit in the snow, more people dying even as they were being rescued. And in the midst of all this horror, there were extraordinary acts of courage. There was a rescuer named John Stark, a big, powerful man who refused to abandon a group of exhausted survivors that others had given up on. Alone, he carried the children out, two at a time, walking them forward through the snow piece by piece, going back again and again for the ones he had left, refusing to let a single one of them die. Because of John Stark, 9 people lived who would otherwise have perished in the snow. He is one of the quiet heroes of this story, a man who simply would not give up on strangers. Not everyone could be saved, and some who could have saved themselves chose not to. At the Alder Creek camp, a few miles from the lake, George Donner, the captain who had given the party its name, was dying. Earlier in the journey, he had cut his hand, and the wound had become badly infected, and now, slowly, it was killing him. His wife, Tamsin Donner, stayed by his side. Tamsin was a remarkable woman. Intelligent, strong, and devoted, she had kept careful records of the journey and had held her family together through the worst of the ordeal. When the rescue parties came, Tamsin Donner had a choice. She was still strong enough to walk out, to save herself, to live. But her husband was dying and could not be moved. And so she made her decision. She sent her children out with the rescuers to safety, to life. And she stayed behind in that frozen camp to be with her husband in his final days. It was a choice made out of pure love. She gave up her own life so that her children could have theirs, and so that her husband would not die alone. By the time the last rescuers came through, both George and Tamsin Donner were gone. Tamsin Donner's children survived, carried out of the mountains by the rescue parties, and they grew up and lived their lives because their mother had chosen to stay behind and let them go. Of all the acts of love in this story, hers may be the one that lingers longest. The last living member of the Donner Party was not brought out of the mountains until late April of 1847, nearly half a year after the families had first been trapped. By then, the snow was finally beginning to melt. The long, terrible winter was over at last. When the final accounting was made, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Of the roughly 87 people who had taken the Hastings Cut-Off and become trapped in the mountains, only about 45 survived. Nearly half had died. They had died of starvation, of cold, of sickness, of sheer exhaustion. They had died on the trail, in the camps, and in the snow of the high passes. Whole families had been shattered. Children had been orphaned. The Donner brothers and their wives were all dead, and those who lived carried the memory of that winter with them for the rest of their lives. But here is something worth holding on to, amid all the sorrow. The families who survived best were often the ones who stayed together, who shared what they had, who refused to give up on one another. The Reed family, remarkably, survived without losing a single member, in large part because James Reed never stopped fighting to get back to them, and because they held together through everything. The same was true of the Breen family. Again and again, in this story, it was love and loyalty, as much as luck, that made the difference between living and dying. And little Patty Reed, 8 years old, walked out of those mountains alive. She had survived deserts and starvation and a winter that killed half the people around her. And through all of it, hidden in her clothes, she had kept one small thing: the tiny wooden doll she had carried from home. A little piece of comfort, of the life she had left behind, of hope, clutched in the hands of a child through the darkest of winters. That doll survives to this day, kept in a museum, a tiny monument to a little girl's endurance. More than 170 years have passed since that terrible winter in the mountains. The place where the families were trapped is no longer a wilderness. There is a highway now, and trains, and a lake that people visit in the summer, where children swim in the very water that once lay frozen beside the dying. The pass that the Donner Party could not cross is crossed by thousands of people every single day, most of them never knowing what happened there, never knowing the names of those who starved in the snow just beyond the road. The mountains kept their name: Donner Lake, Donner Pass, a whole landscape named for a tragedy, for a group of ordinary families who took a wrong turn and paid for it with their lives. It is, in a way, a strange kind of memorial. Most of us, when we are gone, leave no mark on the world at all. The Donner Party left their name on the mountains themselves, but the name remembers the disaster. It does not remember the people, and the people are what matter. Tamsin Donner, who chose to die beside her husband so her children could live. James Reed, who was cast out into the wilderness and fought his way back through deserts and mountains to save his family. John Stark, who carried strangers' children out of the snow on his own back and would not let them die. The 7 of the Forlorn Hope, who walked 33 days through a frozen hell so that others might be saved. And little Patty Reed, who held onto a tiny doll and onto hope and walked out of the mountains alive. It would be easy to remember the Donner Party only for the worst thing that happened to them. For the horror, for the hunger, for the terrible choices forced on them at the very end. That is how legend has remembered them, and it has done them a disservice. Because the real story of the Donner Party is not a story about what people will do to survive. It is a story about what people will do for each other, about mothers who starved themselves to feed their children, about a father who would not stop, about strangers who walked back into the White Death again and again to carry out children they had never met. They were not heroes setting out to be remembered. They were ordinary people, farmers and businessmen and mothers and children chasing a simple dream of a better life. They made a mistake. They paid for it more terribly than almost anyone in history. And in the depths of that suffering, stripped of everything, freezing and starving in the dark, many of them found within themselves a love and a courage and a refusal to give up on one another that still shines across all these years. 87 people set out chasing a dream. Only half of them came back. But those who came back, and even many of those who did not, showed us something about the human heart that is worth remembering. That even in the worst place imaginable, at the very end of all hope, people will still give everything they have for the ones they love. So remember them, not as a ghost story, not as a tale of horror, but as what they truly were. Families, mothers and fathers and children who walked into the mountains together, and who, even there, even then, held onto each other to the very end. If their story moved you, then carry their memory forward. The forgotten people of history live on only as long as someone is willing to remember them, to speak their names, to tell their stories again. By being here, by listening, you have given them that. Walk with me again sometime into the quiet and the snow and the firelight of the past, and let us remember together the ones the world has forgotten. And tell me, before you go, whose story should we tell next? Which forgotten name, which lost soul deserves to be remembered again? Leave it below, and perhaps, when we next gather here in the dark, it will be their story we bring back into the light. Until then, remember the 87 who chased a dream into the mountains. And remember that even in the deepest snow, the human heart can still find a way to love.